Hello everybody and welcome to Rest and Reason. I'm RP the Red Panda and today we're going to be doing the Scythe Fixed video. Now this is kind of a sequel to the Scythe Strengths and Weaknesses video, so if you'd like to know why I'm fixing this game and also why this game's already pretty good, go ahead over to this link and watch that video. But let's go right into why I'm going to fix this and why I think that many games nowadays need fixing and how this works for me fixing the games. So first off, I think that the biggest mistake I've seen with people lately is that their emphasis is on playtesting and not calculating. I find there are so many people who seem in a major rush to get their game to tables for playtesters to try out and not for the game itself to be really solid before bringing it before playtesters. This makes a feedback loop where the people think, oh, I need to get it there because they're going to find all these flaws. And then they bring something with a lot of flaws and then it's found. And so they go, well, obviously that proves my point. It's a confirmation bias. But ultimately, if you do good calculations, you shouldn't have very many problems in playtesting. Now, this doesn't mean that I think playtesting is useless. I would say playtesting should be about 25% of what you're doing for balancing out the game. But 75% of it, 75% should be your calculating. Now, with calculating, there are two main principles, which I'm going to get to in a minute, but I want to point out what playtesting does because calculating is such a big amount. Calculating is you taking the numbers, crunching them in a spreadsheet, but it doesn't prove if the game is fun. And playtesting can show you if people are having fun or not. A spreadsheet can't. The other thing that playtesting does is it helps you with your mindset. It helps expand your mindset. Sometimes, and most of the time, it's going to raise your mindset so that you figure out, oh, there's that factor I didn't quite calculate. Maybe this thing actually has something to do with victory, and I didn't consider it in the first place. So you can add it to your spreadsheet. You can change that by adding just an extra number, usually. And so that's not a big deal. It usually doesn't change a lot about your very well done calculations, but it does tweak things a little bit. It makes sure that it's absolutely polished. The other thing that it can do, though, and this is rare, but it does happen sometimes, is that a playtester will show you a brand new way of looking at your own game to show you what actually is most important in the game as opposed to what you thought was most important. Maybe you thought victory points were most important, but actually this person shows you that the best way to get to victory points is this way, and so you actually needed to calculate how much people could do that to get victory points, not the victory points to balance the game. These are the ones that can make your whole game change, and it's the one that started this problem in the first place because some people who did really good calculations got to playtesters and had this paradigm shift, and then they said, well, screw it, I'm not going to even bring a well-designed game. I'm going to just bring a game so people can then balance it afterwards because I don't want to go through all of that work to change mindsets if I have to. So ultimately, I think that this is what has led to this problem. But also the other problem is calculating. People have trouble with calculating, and especially calculating with asymmetric games like Scythe. So here are the two principles that I use to help calculate and balance games like Scythe. The first one is that you have to calculate based off of optimal performance for the players. The idea here is that there is somebody out there who is going to be able to play each and every faction you design and each and every player board that you design to its absolute best level possible. And you need to be calculating how strong that faction is for that person. And then you need to do that for all of your factions and all of your player boards. This will give you a good baseline because it shows you if the same situation happened, what would it look like? Would it look like there's this giant gap between this faction and this faction? Or would it look like it's almost imperceptible? I can't tell which one's better or worse. In the end, it all came down to just small differences in the skill of the players. That's what you're going for. So optimum performance. If you're doing any other calculations, if you're taking into account, well, what could go wrong? A, it makes the calculations too complicated, and B, it makes the calculations less scientific. Just like in science, you need a baseline. You need something that everything can be compared on. And an optimum performance, everything can be compared on optimum performance pretty easily. But when you start throwing in bumps in the road, there are 1,000 cajillion things you have to put into account, and it just ends up not being a good way to calculate. The other thing that you want to do is take asymmetric factions and mirror them. I find too often people are going too zany with their asymmetric factions, and this sometimes isn't a problem. For example, in games like Small World, and for example, in games like Cosmic Encounter, they're going for that zaniness. They're going for that over-the-top power that's overpowered because all of them are overpowered. But even in those games, what you end up with is, because there are some powers that are just so different from everything else, it was almost impossible for the designers to calculate whether it was balanced. Mirroring makes it so that you can do this a lot easier. If you have a group who's good in the desert and a group who's good in the fields, those two groups are going to be calculated very similarly, but they're still asymmetric. They're still going to play the game very differently and feel very differently from each other. So, if you agree or disagree with any of these principles, please go down, let me know in the comments. I love having conversations with you, and it also helps the community who watches these videos understand that there's more than just my side, and I definitely want that to be the case. Let's get right into our fixes. The fixes are two: the faction boards and the player boards. Now, with the faction boards, I was shocked to find that many of the factions that would have been up at the top, things like the Rusviet, actually ended up being really low in my calculations because of the player boards. You see, the player boards and the faction boards, even though the faction boards had a ranking that I pretty much expected, the player boards made it so that many of the factions that I thought were really good ended up being pretty bad because their starting position didn't work with many of the boards. And many of the groups I thought weren't very good ended up being pretty great because, again, their starting positions worked with the player boards. So, I am going to be doing my fixes in the order of which faction was the best to the worst. So please, in the comments, let me know if you think there was a better faction that should have been at the top and why, or if you agree with my choices. Let's get right into my fixes. First off, we have Albion. Now, Albion, I found in the lore, is actually aiming to destroy the factory. I couldn't believe this because they actually really don't have anything to do with the factory in the game. On top of that, they're aiming for a defensive border. But in the games I've played, they were almost always aiming to just go as far out and spread as much as they could with their flags. So it didn't seem to work thematically. Instead, I changed it to the following two things. First off, Albion is now able to destroy the factory. If you reach the factory with Albion's character and with a special mech called Beowulf, you can play a combat card onto the factory, leave it there, which symbolizes that you blew the factory up with this bunch of bombs or ordnance or whatever you used. You then will be put outside of the factory with your factory card, and nobody else can ever go to the factory again. Nobody can do anything with it ever again. So you've ensured the security of Clan Albion. On top of that, I'm going to put the 4 flags on the border of the Albion homeland, which means those 2 tiles, those 2 hexes that are next to the home base, all 4 of the hexes next to it are getting a flag on them. And for every mech and for your character that are on those spaces at the end of the game, you are going to get bonus points. This makes it so you're aiming for that defensive bonus and for defending your country by blowing up the factory. Next up is Polania. Now, Polania is about their submersible technology a little bit, but ultimately what their lore talks about is surrounding the factory and making sure that nobody else gets to be inside of the factory, using the factory, or around the factory really at all. So, Polania actually is not allowed to be inside of the factory. As soon as they take their factory card, they are actually going to have to vacate the factory. But they can still attack or defend the factory from an adjacent hex. They also are aiming ultimately to have an empty factory and as many of those hexes around the factory empty as possible. They will get points for all of those that are empty. So it makes it more thematic for them. On top of that, their submersible technology, instead of being able to pop up in any lake anywhere, which was both slightly overpowered but also not very thematic, you can now move several spaces next to rivers, which makes it so that you can still move really well as Polania, but it also makes it more thematic as you're traveling in your submarine down rivers. The next faction is the Nordic faction. Now, they are searching for fertile land, farmland, and villages. They're not actually really going for the factory that heavily. They do get a bonus for going to the factory. They get to research something immediately. So that gives them a reason to go to the factory. But ultimately, their reasoning was that they want farms and villages. So I gave them bonuses for farms and villages, both attack bonuses, defense bonuses, and also money bonuses. You get points at the end of the game for owning these territories, which makes it so that they are going to directly conflict with Clan Albion and their defensive positions, but also with the Rusviet for those territories that are fertile right near Rusviet. So ultimately speaking, it's going to help drive the story of the game while also making them more thematic. Next up, we have Saxony. Now, this is our first instance of two factions that are in complete opposite positions. Polania wants empty space around the factory and in the factory. Saxony wants to own the space around the factory. So they get bonus points for owning the spaces around the factory. However, you might have already noticed that these two opposite factions who could really butt heads the whole game could instead work together. Just like Polania, Saxony cannot go in to that hex. They can't go into the factory after grabbing the factory card. They have to leave it immediately. On top of that, though, they can only be in 3 of the 6 spots, which means 3 of them and the factory would be empty if Saxony had its way. That would leave a lot of points for Polania and a lot of points for Saxony if they work together. But it also takes a lot of points from both of them to have the other one in the area, possibly. So, are you going to aim for diplomacy or to attack each other? It's all up to you, and you could maybe even mix the strategies. The next group that is a direct opposite of a group is the Rusviets and the Albions. The Albions want to blow up the factory. The Rusviets want to be the only ones to ever get there and own it. So when they get to the factory, they immediately get a bonus. First off, Olga, their character, is actually searching for her fiancé. So when you get there, you actually get a mech that represents him and his battalion of mechs that went out to war. So you get the bonus of a mech, and you will get points for every faction that doesn't get a factory card. Now, yet again, you're probably noticing, just like with Polania and Saxony, that there is something you could do diplomatically. You see, if Albion gets a card and then blows it up, and you've gotten a card, that means less people have gotten cards. The rest of the players can never get a card. So maybe you want Albion to take that. But if Albion takes it, they get a card, which means you lose points. On top of that, it might take them a while to get there. And so by the time they get there and blow it up, other people might have already gotten there. So maybe it's just better if you take it and keep it. Who knows? And that's, again, up to you as the diplomat, as the person playing the game, to make this decision. So Rusviet also has that little bonus from that mech that makes it so its popularity goes down less because it's her fiance, and it's a beautiful story between the two of them of love and caringness, and it's going to help them look better to the people that maybe they're having to push along, but they can make a better argument, a better case, a more human case to those people. The next group is the Crimeans, and the Crimean Khaganate is aiming for some tech from the factory, so they get the same bonus as the Nords. They get to go there, they grab a factory card, and they also get to research something. But they don't really get much else. What they're aiming for is more to make peace with the world, and they're going to make peace with the world by being mercenaries and working for other factions. Whenever they're adjacent to another faction, they can help a faction in a battle. They put a combat card into the battle for a faction that they choose before the battle begins. That could tilt the balance of the battle to one side or the other. Then they put that card onto that faction's board, and that faction pays half of the cost, half of the power, rounded down in coins. That means they're getting victory points for it. On top of it, it makes it a peace treaty. Now that you've fought together, you can make the argument, hey, we've fought with you, we've been on your side, you need to leave us alone. So you have to leave them alone, they have to leave you alone. But you're clever. and you can still use mercenaries against them because you can only not do direct attacks on each other. And technically, when you're helping somebody else, you're not directly attacking them. So you can choose one of two strategies. You can either try to make peace with everybody and get a bunch of points from everybody by using these cards with everybody, or you could help just a few people over and over and over again, getting a bunch of money from them specifically. It's all, again, up to you how you make peace and how you play the game. The last group is the Togawa Shogunate. The Togawa Shogunate is aiming at two things. First off, the character, Akiko, is aiming to find her brother, Natsuo. Now, I gave him that name because there was no name in the lore. But he's a mechanic, so when you get to the factory, you are immediately going to get a mech, because I'm picturing that when they came that long distance, they went in a mech. Makes sense. And that mech, whenever it's with you, it has to stay with you. But on that tile, whenever you buy another mech, you pay less money because he's an engineer and it's cheaper for him. On top of this, you are aiming for one big goal. Stop the Rusviet. According to the lore, their whole goal is to make it so the Rusviet have a harder time doing what they're doing, especially when it comes to the factory. So you have the Rusviet home base. Underneath that, to the west, is the factory. You have 6 tiles between the Rusviet and their factory. 4 of those tiles are land tiles. If you can place your 4 traps and have them armed, you're going to get points for each and every armed trap between the Rusviet and the factory. Because your goal is to stop the Rusviet from doing their plans, and having traps there will ensure in the future that they can't do their plans. Now, you might be wondering, this seems really direct in its conflict between the two. So how could you possibly make a treaty? Well, first off, you could possibly mention that they could go around it. Remember, this is in the south and to the west, not in the north and to the west. So the Soviets, the Rusviets, could always just go to the north. And that actually would work out for both factions and possibly protect the Rusviet from a bunch of factions coming from this direction, from the west, to attack the Rusviet. So, again, you have to choose. Do you want to try to be diplomatic about it, or do you want to directly conflict, or in the middle? Now, if you're appreciating this content, please click on that like button, click on that subscribe button, and let us know. Moving on to the player boards, one of the biggest changes I made with the player boards is that there are specific player boards for each faction depending on what difficulty you want in the game. There's an easy mode, a medium mode, and a hard mode. And this makes it so that you don't get random faction boards that do not work at all with your faction. This was the biggest problem balance-wise in the original game. You would get factions with a peaceful board that were supposed to be all about war. You would get ones with all about war player boards that were factions that were all about peace. It didn't work. So you have to make it so that there are these specific groups. So each of these will have listed on them which group it would be for an easy, medium, or hard mode, but you might be asking, how does this not majorly decrease the replayability? Well, even though it does decrease it a little bit, I totally admit, the biggest thing is you still have 7 factions, if you have the expansion, or 5 factions that you can play at each level. That's still 15 games of completely new things. And because I've created more synergetic board faction relationships, you are going to be able to try to work hard at mastering them, which will take several games at least. So I would highly encourage anybody who has already played Scythe with the normal boards, try out my boards. Why not? It's going to give you more replayability because you've never played my boards before. You're going to get to play something that's more lore heavy, and you're going to have a new challenge. And finally, you're going to have the opportunity to comment underneath this video and let me know how badly I did or how well I did. Ultimately, it's a win-win-win for you and a win for me because I get you to tell me how I did. So let's go into the player boards. There are 4 different groups of 2 player boards each, and they are the Expansionist, Isolationist, Capitalist, and Globalist. These are the 4 different types of outward facing. How are they interacting with the world? First off, the Expansionists are aiming for steel, wood, and missions. They get 3 missions, and they can do 2 of those mission cards. So they are aiming for their own special goals, which makes a lot of sense. For an expansionist, they usually define their goals for themselves. On top of that, they aim for steel and wood, so they want big armies, and then they want to take territory. When they take it, they want to build it up, make it really valuable with lots of buildings. This includes the Imperial and the Fascist factions. Next up, we have the Isolationists. Now, the Isolationists are a little bit similar to the Expansionists. They want wood, then steel, then missions. So just like the Expansionists on missions, the difference here is that they aim to build up their territory more, and their mechs are definitely about taking stuff, but more about making sure that their area is safe. This includes the monarchic and the communist governments. And I know obviously that these governments have had versions that have been all the various things I'm mentioning, but I'm going off of their predominant tilt in history, what they generally would end up being if they were this type of government. Next up, we have the capitalists. They go for oil, food, and money. They start the game with more money than any of the other groups, which is guaranteed points that they have, and unless they spend them on silly stuff, they're going to have them for good. On top of that, they aim for technology and diplomacy, the food, the envoys that they can put that end up getting them stuff for everybody else succeeding. So they're a little bit more focused on, yes, they're focused on themselves succeeding, but ultimately they also succeed a little bit by everybody else succeeding. This includes the Republican and the oligarchic governments. The last two governments are globalist governments. They are food first, oil second, and popularity. Oil is second because ultimately they want to work together with the world. And so with food, you can get those things that make it so you want other people to be doing well. Because if other people are doing well and making stuff, you're going to be getting more stuff. And ultimately, the globalist goal is to get a bunch of stuff from everybody else and then to get more stuff by themselves to ultimately propel themselves to victory and win. They also want technology, which is what the oil represents, and popularity. They start with the highest amount of popularity, which means they, again, just like the capitalists, have kind of this almost guaranteed points. As long as they don't be extremely violent, which isn't really the goal of a globalist anyway, they are going to end up with a high amount of points from their popularity. And the last two in globalist were the democratic and socialist governments. Now, you might have noticed that this actually sounds somewhat unbalanced. The first two groups, the expansionists and isolationists, get a lot of their points from missions, and the last two groups get permanent points from coins and popularity. So how is this balanced? Well, just like Jamie Stegmaier pointed out, the factions take turns in order, which is the order that I just gave them in. That's the exact order that these factions are going to go in. So the first faction and the last faction can't have the same amount of power because they're probably not going to get the same number of turns. And I made sure that this would work really well because the first four who get more turns have more turns to complete missions and get points from missions. And the last four have less turns but more victory points inherently so that they can be stronger despite not getting as many turns. So let's get to the final score. Now, the final original score of the game was a 3.76 out of 5, and that gives it a silver recliner. Still an excellent game, still a game that I would say any 4Xer would enjoy owning. However, it did have some major weaknesses that kept it from being a gold recliner, which I believe this has fixed many of them. Not everything was fixed. I didn't really get to fix the mechanical theme much at all, especially in the battles, but this does fix most of the problems, and thus it goes to a 4.16 out of 5, which makes it a golden recliner. I would say this game is a game that you guys should go buy and try. I would try it the original way first, and then try my expansion second. And for those people who have already played the game, there's no cost to you to try this out. It's down in the link in the description for free. I tried to make it really pretty. It's going to be a really interesting, even just one game where you're going to get to try this out and be like, oh, I don't like this, or I do like this. It's going to make the game of Scythe more fun because you're going to get a whole new gameplay of it. So definitely try it out and let me know in the comments whether you liked it or not. And thank you so much for staying this far deep into the video. I know there's a lot of content and information in this video. I'm sorry I couldn't make it shorter. I usually aim for 12 to 15 minutes, and this one definitely is hitting the 20-minute mark. So thank you to all of you who made it through to this point. And if you did, I'm assuming you're really enjoying the content. So I would love if you could go over to the Patreon page and support this channel. It means a lot. It helps us keep doing what we're doing. And as always, thank you so much for joining us today on Rest in Reason.